In 4.4 and 4.5, there are two different methods that you can use to factor. The other video I did the box method. In this video, I'm going to show you how to do grouping. You can pick whichever one you're more comfortable with, and then just be really good at using whichever one that you pick. Now, number 1 and number 2, and all of them, we're going to do the grouping, and this is actually the way you were taught in 9th grade. Miss Miles and I prefer the box when we teach it in 9th grade. I think Miss Shire and Mr. McBurney prefer grouping. Doesn't really matter one way or the other. No matter what method you pick, you have to make sure that in this problem, as you can see, I hope, there is no GCF. Because of that, we identify A as 1, we identify B as 6, and C as 8. Hopefully this is ringing a bell. The next thing we do is we identify A times C. So 1 times 8 is 8. Now, we need two numbers that are going to multiply to that 8 I just found, but they need to add, whatever two numbers you pick, they need to add to this magic B value of 6. So if you're not very good at like multiplication, you can just start with, okay, well, I know 1 times 8 is 8, but that adds to 9. I need it to add to 6, so move up. 2 times 4 makes 8, and that adds to 6. There we go. I found the magic two numbers. No, it will not always be that easy. Once you find those two magic numbers, each of those numbers is going to get an X. Let me show you. Let me give you some recall here from 9th grade. You keep the x squared term, and you keep the plus 8 in the back. But instead of writing plus 6, you replace that with a positive 2x and a positive 4x in the middle. So you still actually have the 6 in the middle, you're just separating it into those two magic numbers. Break the problem in half. The GCF of this side is just an x. When you pull an x out, you will be left with x plus 2. The GCF of this side is a positive, because that sign is positive, 4. When you pull a 4 out, you will get x plus 2. If these parentheses match, you know you did it right. Your final answer is that parenthesis that matched, that x plus 2, and what was outside of the parentheses, x plus 4. That is factored. Number 4. Notice again there is no GCF. So I identify A, B, and C, and you need to identify A times C. That would be 2 times 5 is 10. Now it's time for us to do what two numbers, it's like a puzzle, multiply to that 10 I just found, but they add to that B value of negative 11 up there. So maybe you're thinking, well, I know that 2 times 5 is 10, but 2 times 5 makes 7, not negative 11. Okay, 1 times 10 is 10. When you add them, you get 11. You need a negative 11, so if you make these both negative, that keeps that at a positive 10, and it makes that a negative 11. You found the two magic numbers. You keep the 2x squared in the front. You keep the plus 5 in the back. This minus 1 gets an x, and the minus 10 also gets an x. Notice the negative 11 has been broken down into these two things, divided in half. The GCF of these first two is an x. When you take an x out, you're going to be left with 2x minus 1 when you divide it out. And if that sign is a negative, that means you're pulling out a negative. What goes into both of those? A 5. Divide by negative 5, you get positive 2x and negative 1. As long as these parentheses match, you've done it right. The final answer is the parentheses that match and the numbers outside. And that is factored. The third problem has a special thing to it, and hopefully you remember from Algebra 1, you have to find a GCF. This one has one. The GCF is 3. Let's take it out. take out a 3 and write what's left. Divide it out. So divide and you'll get 2x squared. Divide, you'll get 3x. Divide and you get 2. Each of these things gets divided by 3. Because I have a 3 here, I will have a 3 in my final answer. Okay, so do not forget this 3 in your final answer. Get rid of the first equation and identify A, B, and C in your new equation. You also need to identify AC, which is 2 times negative 2, which is negative 4. Now it's time to find that little chart. I need numbers that multiply to that number I just found, negative 4. And I need them to add to this middle term, the B value of 3. Add to 3. So I know that 1 times negative 4 makes negative 4. But unfortunately, that adds to negative 3. If I switch my signs, negative 1 times positive 4, that will add to my positive 3. These are the key numbers, and they will each get an x or whatever variable is in your problem. Now it's time to rewrite. So we're right here, right? We had that 3 out in front. Don't forget him later on, but right now we're going to do 2x squared, and now we're going to plug in these two middle terms, minus 1x plus 4x. So we don't do this middle term, and then minus 2 in the back comes down. Cut your problem in half. The first half, take out an x. When you divide out an x, you'll be left with 2x minus 1. In the second set, you're going to take out a positive because that sign is positive, and the number that they both have is a 2. When you divide by positive 2, you'll be left with 2x and minus 1. Note these two parentheses match. I know I did it right. So I carry out my 2x minus 1 and my leftover x plus 2. Do not forget the GCF from way up top of 3. Number 20. Notice there is no GCF in number 20. So you identify A, B, and C. You also need to find AC as 2 times negative 3, which makes negative 6. I need you to remember to find numbers that multiply to that negative 6, but they need to add to that middle number up there of negative 5. Well, I know 1 times 6 makes 6, but I need to make a negative 5 when I add and a negative 6 when I multiply. So I know it can't be these because that makes a positive 6. So maybe you're thinking 2 times negative 3. Well, that'll work when you multiply, but it won't work when you add, because if you add, you get negative 1. The answer is negative 6 and positive 1. You have to have different signs to make a negative, and this is the only combination that's going to give you negative 5. These are the magic numbers. It's time to rewrite. So keep your 2x squared. Do not write your negative 5x, but instead write these two with an x. So minus 6x and plus 1x, and carry that minus 3 over. Split your problem in half. The GCF of these two is a 2 and an x. When you divide by 2 and x, you're left with just x, and a minus, divide by 2 and x, a 3. You have to be pretty good at taking stuff out. On this one, bring out a positive. The only number that goes into both of those is a 1. You will be left with x minus 3. Your parentheses match. You know you did it right. Drag down the parentheses that match and the leftovers from the outside, the 2x and the plus 1. That problem is factored. The ones on the bottom are different. The ones on the bottom are different because they are comprised of 4 terms. With these ones, you look for a GCF to start with. Notice there is no GCF. Let's write that above the problem. Okay. Notice there is no GCF. That means this is actually easier than the problems above. You cut the problem in half and you find the GCF of each side. Over here, you just pull out an x. When you do, you get 3x plus y. And over here, the GCF is a negative sign and the number 4. Let's pull out a negative 4. That's going to turn that into a positive 3x. And if I pull out a negative 4, that turns this into a positive y. Notice your parentheses match. So you have 3x plus y because of your matching parentheses and x minus 4. You can always check these back together because this makes 3x squared, this makes minus 12x, this makes positive xy, this makes negative 4y, and all of those were part of the original. Number 6, notice there is no GCF. Yes, you have to look for that every single time. Okay? Split it in half. The GCF over here is not just b, it's b squared. Both of them have a b squared. Take out or divide out a b squared, you should be left with b plus 3. On this side, they bring down the negative sign and take out the number 2, or divide out the number 2. That's going to give you a positive b when you divide it out and a positive 3. Notice your parentheses match. B plus 3 and the leftover b squared minus 2. Yes, you should check these back together. That makes b to the third. That makes minus 2b, which you can see right there. That makes 3b squared, which you can see there. And that makes minus 6 in the back. On the back, it's important to notice that the directions have changed. They say solve now. I need you to make sure whenever the directions say solve, you set the problems equal to 0. So in number 5, the first step is, you see this, I need to move these two things to the other side. It has to be set equal to 0. 2x squared minus 7x minus 4 equals 0. And guess what? We're going to look for a GCF. Notice there is no GCF in this problem, so I move on. This is a trinomial. Trinomials, you need to identify A, B, and C. And we also need AC. So that would be 2 times negative 4, which yields negative 8. Now it's time to make that chart. I need numbers that multiply to negative 8, that number I just came up with, and they make this negative 7 when you add them. Please don't look at the original problem anymore, okay? Only look at this new one that you set equal to 0. So you might think, well, I know 2 and 4, or maybe 2 and negative 4 makes negative 8 when you multiply. It makes negative 2 when you add. So I'm going to use instead some form of 1 and 8. Now I need a negative 8 when I multiply, so one of them's got to be negative, and a negative 7, so I'll make the big guy negative. There you go. Now it's time to rewrite your problem. Keep the 2x squared. Do not keep the minus 7x, but instead replace it with these two. So a positive 1x and a negative 8x from those two you just came up with, and the minus 4 in the back. Cut your problem in half. This side you can find a GCF of x, which will leave you with 2x plus 1 when you factor it out. This side you pull out a negative because that first sign is negative, and a 4. Divide by negative 4, you're left with positive 2x and positive 1 when you divide by negative 4. Notice the parentheses match. You did it right. So pull out your 2x plus 1 and you're left with x minus 4. Remember though, these ones say you have to solve them because they were set equal to something. So take each parenthesis, like 2x plus 1, and set it equal to 0. And that's just the first parenthesis, all I did so far. First parenthesis made it equal to 0. Minus 1, so you have 2x equals negative 1. Divide by 2, x is negative 1/2. And now you found the value of x. On this side, you do x minus 4 equals 0. Add 4 to both sides, and you get x equals positive 4. These are the two values that if you plug them in way up here to the very tippy top, you would get one side equal to the other side. Maybe you would get like 32 equals 32 or 0 equals 0, okay? Number 8, first step, always number 8. Oh, is that you pull out, no doubt, that GCF every time I've looked for it. So you pull out a 2 and an X because this problem actually has a GCF. A lot of them don't. When I pull out the 2 and the X, let's talk about what's left. You are left with divide by 2 and by X, just a little old X. Divide by 2 and by X, you're left with a positive 5. Something I do need to point out here is that you don't have a trinomial, so this is not a trinomial. So you are not going to do, because it's not a trinomial, you're not going to do ABC. Okay? Notice this is not perfect squares. So you're not going to do that other thing we did with perfect squares. So it's done. It is ready to solve. Set this equal to 0 to solve it. We should like this problem. Set this equal to 0 and solve it. This one divide by 2. X still equals 0. This one subtract 5. And X is going to give you negative 5. Now you know what I wish I would have pointed out at the very beginning? Notice this was set equal to 0 at the very get-go. That is really, really important that it was set equal to 0. But these are the two values that if you plug them in for X, you would get a 0 at the end. We like that one. That was just a GCF problem. One more trinomial. You know you got to look for it, right? You should notice there is no GCF in this problem. All right. Because there is no GCF, I'm going to move on to A, B, C, because it's a trinomial. You have to find AC, which is 3 times 2, which makes 6. Now I need numbers that multiply to 6, and they need to add to that middle number of negative 5. So you might be thinking, well, what about 1 and negative 6? What's the problem with that? That doesn't multiply to positive 6. I can't use that. I need it to multiply to positive 6, not to negative 6. So maybe we're thinking 2 and 3. Well, that's better. At least you multiply to positive 6 now, but that certainly adds to a positive 5. Well, if we make them both negative, that's going to give us that positive 6 and a negative 5. These are the two magic numbers. Time to rewrite. 3x squared. Do not write minus 5x, but instead replace it with these two. Minus 2x minus 3x, that's what these two magic numbers were all about. And keep the plus 2. Again, I should have mentioned, do you see how it's equal to 0? It is so important that it's equal to 0 before you start your problem. Cut this problem in half. The GCF of these two is an x. When you divide out an x, you are left with 3x minus 2, so just the x comes out. And on this side, it's a negative sign. Now, what number goes into both of these? The only answer? 1. So you divide by negative 1. That's going to leave you with a positive 3x and a minus or a negative 2. Look at how your parentheses match. That means you did it right. Write the factored form like we did on the front page. 3x minus 2 plops out and x minus 1 goes in the back. But remember, these directions say solve. So you have to take each of those parentheses and you got one more step. Set each equal to 0. And solve. Over here, you add 2. 3x equals 2. Over here, you divide by 3. X equals 2/3. Over here, you add 1, and you get x equals 1. These are the two solutions that you must have in order to solve this problem and get 0. Now down here, these two problems, we're going to do these in class. What I want you to see is that it says to solve by graphing. To do that, I'm going to teach you how to use your calculator. And just like up above, they have to be set equal to 0. So quickly, let's at least do that much on this problem. Let's take those two things over so that it's set equal to 0. X squared minus 2x minus 4 equals 0. And tomorrow we'll play around with your calculator until we get the two answers that we need for both this one and that one.